sort of response, but we don't, I definitely don't want to dominate. So I'm happy to speak for about 5 to 6 minutes, 7 max.
Okay, but it's also nice to have a discussion and conversation rather also than me having just a monologue. But I wanted to say that because of the time, I excluded one slide and I put it at the very end. So if there is time for me, I'll just go back to that slide just because, with that slide can't be 15 minutes for sure. And then, I can go back to that. But this is how I did it, just to make sure I try and stick to the time. And then if there is anything to expand on, I added this slide at the very end. Uh-huh.
Is this streamed on YouTube? Oh, wow.
That's
True Polymedia, Sanja. Okay.
Mirca, how you're not feeling okay with this?
No,
Or
I'm completely fine. I wasn't aware, but that's totally fine.
yeah, I think ASEN always does these book series in this way. Am I right, David? That yeah, it's not the case with this particular book event. But in a way, I guess it's a good for the visibility of this talk, given that I know many people who won't be able to join for this particular occasion, but who were eager to learn. So
For sure, yeah.
unless it puts any one of you at unease, I don't know.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Have you tried your slides, Sanja? Because that's always.
I haven't tried sharing them. Let me see. May I just check, David, will you introduce each speaker? Oh, this is a good point, Mirca.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. Yes.
Sorry. Yes. I'm just trying to see. Okay, what are you seeing at the moment?
The stars.
Okay, good. So I'm just trying to see how Microsoft Office share open system settings. Oh, sorry, I need to in my system settings to enable Zoom too. Sorry, I need to quit and reopen because I'm just giving Zoom access to my Microsoft. So if you can bear with me for a second.
That's why I thought it's good to check it before before the guests come in, because that's.
Okay, let me now try. Yeah, now it seems it's working. Let me click on this. Can you? Okay, perfect. I will.
Phone's on now.
Are we going to see the people, or is this a webinar? It's just going to be the 5 of us.
Correct.
Okay.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to today's ASEN book presentation series on Doing Nation in a Digital Age, Banal Expressions of Nationalism and Cosmopolitanism in Polymedia Environments by Sanja Vico. And I'm delighted that we're joined by an all-star cast, Sanja herself, along with Mirca Madianou, Birgül Yılmaz and Sandra Obradović. This event we had to postpone at short notice because unfortunately I came down with the flu, so I'm delighted that we've been able to reschedule it. And we're doing this in conjunction with the Centre for European Studies at the University of Exeter. And I do have to briefly mention, because they did both say that they were going to watch, both of my parents have degrees from the University of Exeter. So, and we've got 2 extra people here with us today. So, obviously we've got Sanja with her, who's a lecturer in communications and digital media at the University of Exeter. Mirca Madianou is professor in the Department of Media, Communications and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths at the University of London. Sandra Obradović is a senior lecturer in psychology at the Open University and a researcher at the Electoral Psychology Observatory at the LSE. And Birgül Yılmaz is senior lecturer in intercultural communication, again at the fabulous University of Exeter, where she's also one of the university senators, which, you know, so welcome, Madam Senator. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you to everybody who's joining us on Zoom, on Facebook, on YouTube. If you have any questions, do please put them in whichever chat you are looking at us, watching us on. So the running order for today is Sanja is going to present her book for 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to go to Sandra, to Birgül, to Mirca for their contributions, and then have a discussion and take questions and hopefully get some answers. So I think without further ado from me, Sanja, shall I head over to you?
Thank you so much, David, for organizing and indeed for chairing, and thanks to everyone else. I'll start sharing my screen. Can you see all the presentation? Yeah. Okay. Thank you again. So the way I'll present this book is I'll first zoom out to talk about the approach of the book and some of the key contributions to the fields of media and communications, media nationalism, media and globalization. And then later I'll zoom in to look at some specific examples and analyze them. As you can see, the book has 9 chapters and it speaks to the themes of social media, nation nationalism, but also migration, specifically migration to the UK, identity and the Balkans. So I'm hoping it can be interesting to scholars interested in these themes. The book explores how Serbian Londoners navigate digital media environments to negotiate their identities with a focus on the banal expressions of nationalism and cosmopolitanism. And it is based on, it is based on over 3-year-long ethnographic research that included both traditional and digital ethnography and 40 in-depth interviews. Based on these insights, it introduces a theory and concept of doing nation to argue that the nation comes into being and is sustained through everyday interpersonal communication practices that have become increasingly mediated. And as such, I suggest, or I argue, that the nation shouldn't be thought of as a verb, as a noun, but rather as a verb, doing nation, as that signals a dynamic process. And therefore, the nation represents embodied, discursive, and cultural practices, and not necessarily an abstract imagined community, as Benedict Anderson has famously claimed. I find that national practices are embedded in a whole range of other areas of life, such as family practices, and that what traditionally is thought of as family practices, also practices that do nation. And here I can give you an example of Slava, which is the Saint Patron's Day, that has been included in the UNESCO's intangible cultural heritage. And as such, it's a national practice because it's very specific to Serbs and Montenegrins, but it's also family practices because it is a celebration of Saint Patron of a family. So every family's surname is linked to Saint Patron. And communicative effectiveness of doing nation, it's important to say, depends on the authority of the speaker, reception or the uptake, and context. This is why very often, as you'll see in my following slides, strong relationships are particularly important for the practices that do nation, because strong relationships are more likely to secure understanding of the meanings, and it is the understanding of the meanings that without this, I mean, communicative practices fail to do the nation. The everyday dimension of these practices means that they happen on a regular basis, daily or weekly, but also that they are unremarkable, mundane, and hardly worth talking about. You'll see later in slides a lot of pictures about food, about some famous figures, about places to go out, and things like that. Some other key insights include that there is a remarkable diversity of migrants of the same origin. And the time of migration I found to be a key explanatory variable for their communication practices and their performances of identities, which is a bit different to a lot of migration studies that emphasize that generational identity is crucial. And I found that more recent migrants have very pronounced professional identities. So this is how it looks like when I say there is no single Serbian diaspora in London or single explanation what these migrants look like. And I could broadly identify three waves. As you can see, each wave is diverse in itself, and perhaps the most heterogeneous is the second wave. Each wave is related to certain events in the former Yugoslavia, and here I should say I just didn't study Serbs from Serbia, but from all former Yugoslav republics. So these times of migration are associated with certain events that trigger the migration and also their motivations for migration. And in the first wave, you can see there are some royalists, which is linked to the end of the Second World War and the real socialist regime in the former Yugoslavia. And then second wave is associated to the civil war of the 90s that wasn't fought on the Serbian soil, but of course Serbia was involved and consequences were felt there. And then you have third wave, which we can associate with democratic transitions and changes. And this is the way where you get a lot of people with very pronounced professional identities. As you can see students, young professionals. Most of people oscillate between national and cosmopolitan identities, which is in line with Mirca Madianou's observations also in her book, Mediating the Nation. And there are multiple banal nationalisms and diversification of the national identity, which is linked to the previous slide that I showed you regarding this diversity of these migrants. And this is what happens, as other scholars also pointed out, that diversification of national identity happens when, more people have ability to voice their perceptions of how they see their national identity, what their nation is about. It's very important to say that doing nation doesn't preclude cosmopolitan identities, as you'll see in in the following slides. Some of these practices, of performances of cosmopolitan identity are also used strategically to correct their national identity or to present their national identity in a more favorable light. And therefore, cosmopolitan identity can paradoxically reproduce national identity. I also observed some differences between how these people engage with publicly and privately oriented digital media. By public, I mean like Facebook, X, or formerly Twitter, Instagram, and privately refers to platforms such as WhatsApp or Viber. Viber is another instant messaging platform, very popular in the Balkans, countries like Serbia or Greece as well. Social class is often used as a tactic, especially among this third wave of migrants, which also resonates to some other studies, and I'll show you in another slide to illustrate this point. However, ethnicity is not strictly central to working class migrants, which is a bit different to what we know from other migration studies, but it's also important for the middle class and more affluent ones. And also, finally, affordances of social media, such as mobility, temporality, and spreadability, have a crucial role in sustaining a national identity in a digital age. And I'll show you a slide to illustrate these points. So, banal expressions of nationalism and cosmopolitanism were observed in both so-called privately and publicly oriented social media platforms. However, their consequences or intentions were different. As you can see, on publicly oriented platforms, they aimed at correcting very often they were a strategy or were very strategic, these identity performances aimed at correcting national identity, whereas on privately oriented platforms, they often led to reinforcing identities. So these are some examples of banal expressions of cosmopolitanism on publicly oriented platforms. Both examples were taken from Instagram. So if you look at the first example, you'll see a tip left in different currencies. And then if you read the caption, it says, "This is how my crew leaves a tip." And then hashtag London, international, expat life, which shows you how what I previously said, how social class is embedded in these identity performances, but also how one of key feature of this presentation of cosmopolitanism is emphasis on international circles of friends. And this is the same as with the other example of Instagram Reel. One participant went to Chinese karaoke night in an upscale restaurant in London. And this is, again, emphasis on international circles of friends, more affluent lifestyle or middle-class lifestyle. And then some examples of banal nationalism, again, on privately oriented social media or digital media platforms. Here we have Instagram again. So if you look at this post, for example, it features food, but then also when you read, it says, "Preparing a feast for tomorrow. Traditional Serbian cabbage rolls, sarma, is just a half meal for festive occasions like Christmas." So if you read this and you see how it's been framed, you can understand that this is meant for international audiences. It's meant to inform foreigners or people from other culture and national backgrounds of the Serbian tradition, cuisine, and what they see their national identity to be about. So this is how it's been, a strategy of presenting a national identity in a more favorable light. Similarly to this example of a Time Out magazine that featured it dedicated a whole page to the Serbian month in London, which happens during February every year. And then you read a caption, and it says, "My colleague was excited to share the latest Time Out magazine with me this morning as it features Serbia and Serbian places to eat and drink in London. It's the first article about Serbia in a while. It doesn't talk about the war, but instead mentions our royal family, Novak Djokovic, Marina Abramović, Roxane Delincic, to name a few." So here you can again clearly see that it's meant for, again, international audience. It's meant to portray Serbian identity in a more favorable light, but also that some of key ways to do it is through food, through some prominent figures. Some other examples would also include some landscapes and so on. And some of this work that talks about identity performances on publicly oriented platforms has been previously published in journals such as Television and New Media, but also my awarded article, Globalized Difference, Identity Policy in Social Media, in Journal of Diaspora, Global Diaspora and Media. And now to zoom in what happens in privately oriented social media platforms, and what happened also during interviews where I try to understand also their backgrounds. Angela is a third-year migrant. She was 32 at the time. She was 5-year-old when her family left Serbia, and she had lived in several different countries before she arrived in London. Prior to London, she was in New York doing her bachelor's degree, and she came into London for her master's degree. And at the time when she joined my research, she had lived in London for at least 5 years. And here she says the following: "What is cool about these new forms of media is how quickly we can build and maintain these new identities. When I was 18, I had just a simple Motorola mobile phone. It was cool, but all I could do was to text and call. For me to stay in touch with my family, I had to call and email them, and emails were only from physical computers. The first few years while I was in New York, I felt I was a little bit out of touch with my Serbian roots because there was just no way for me to do anything about it, and I spoke Serbian so rarely. Only when I picked up my phone and calls were so expensive. It's only when I got my BlackBerry that I had Facebook and emails on my phone, which made it all easier. But you didn't have Wi-Fi calling and stuff. You still didn't have immediate contact with people. But now I can speak Serbian every day, so I think it makes it easier to maintain these little identities which you build up along the way, because you're kind of always surrounded by the people who support that kind of identity. But then again, it is not really tied to a nation state. I think it is based on your life experiences, places where you grew up, where you have lived for a really long time. I don't identify with a nation. I identify with traditions I was raised with and with the food. I don't think it's about where, I think it's about who. So I think why I left this quote there at length is because it really shows you several things that I've already pointed out. On the one hand, the importance of these affordances of social media, such as mobility and temporality, which enable this immediate contact. As you can see, this comparison between having to get in touch through physical computer or now having smartphones with 5G supported internet connection, but also the importance of strong ties and strong relationships for the communicative practices of doing nation. And also how it is about the food. It's about the people and not strictly geography. As she says, it's not about where, it's about who. And the next slide, I think it also speaks to this theme where the same participant shares on Facebook her experience of being part of a family WhatsApp group, which is a really good example of a connected presence and where you're getting constant stream of messages. And she says the family chat is sometimes annoying, like those 63 messages that I got sent in the hour you were indisposed in a client meeting. But it's more often the little moments of hilarity, kindness, support, and love that makes me smile, that makes me so thankful for the Milo clan. And here it shows how, as I said at the very beginning, how these family practices are very much intertwined with the national practices. Because through these practices, the speaker gets the authority, and this is what ensures the, as I said, uptake or the reception for this slide, for these quotes to make to be possible. And to draw a conclusion, so what is important is that Doing Nation shows how identities are constructed through words and become meaningful through embodied cultural practices. Particularly mediated interpersonal communication is with significant others. And what I perhaps should have said at the beginning, as Austin says, by saying something, we are doing something. When you say I do before the register, it is to marry. And also, as Bourdieu would say, words don't get their power in themselves, but they get legitimized through social practices. Doing Nation supplements existing relevant concepts such as banal nationalism and long-distance nationalism, but putting emphasis on the interpersonal. And it's important to say that communication practices of Doing Nation neither reproduce one single diaspora nor a nation, and also that it doesn't preclude cosmopolitanism, that is, that banal nationalism, banal cosmopolitanism are not necessarily antagonistic. I could also add that the book is rooted in the socio-technical approach to studying social media by showing how different identity performances are made possible thanks to combination of technical, social, and cultural factors. And finally, the theory of Doing Nation has wider applicability, even though it was developed within a particular migration context. I would argue it has applicability to other national migration contexts, as relationships of distance and proximity have become commonly reliant on a variety of digital platforms. And I shall stop there. Please do get in touch. I'm on different social media platforms and via email.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Sanja. This was fascinating. I've read a few chapters of your book, and it's nice to hear this overview from you. So I've got my notes on my laptop, and I'm going to minimize you, so I'm not going to be able to see you. But give me a hands up when I'm over my 7-8 minutes. Is that okay, David? Okay. Yes. So I've thought about a few key contributions that your book makes, and I quite like the methodological richness of the book, because you're looking at both online and offline practices of your interlocutors, as well as combining aspects of autoethnography and in-depth interviews and media maps and all sorts of other things that I think enriches your methodology. Especially the autoethnographic part was quite interesting for me, because you also bring your own voice and your own experience of being Serbian Londoner. And especially the Doing Nation of transnational families was quite interesting for me, because as a sociolinguist, I'm thinking about how these transnational practices, for example, have an impact on people's linguistic repertoires, how, for example, the languages spoken back at home become part of people's everyday practices in a city like London. And the discursive strategies of stigmatization and counter-stigmatization was quite interesting for me, because I think we discuss stigma a lot, but didn't see much on counter-stigmatization. So this was quite interesting. And also this comparison between the connected migrant, who's connected to back home, and other Serbians in London versus the uprooted migrants. This was very, very interesting for me. And I also liked how you talked about the issue of whiteness among the, for the Serbian Londoners, because we do, I think, need to talk a little bit more about how whiteness is also something constructed, that it's got nothing to do with one's color. And I thought this could be one of the future directions, perhaps, of your work. You can actually comment on this a little bit more, but I thought we need to perhaps talk a little bit more on what we mean by whiteness, especially among those who are not, your typical people of color. And this inferiority and superiority complex associated with Balkanism was quite interesting, because in my research in Greece, I've observed similar issues around Greek national identity. Well, scholars argue that it's more or less, similar issues, that after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Balkans, including the Greeks, were between this having, inferior and superior compared to the other Europeans. So in my field work, for example, in Athens, I came across with this term of, for example, real Europe. Whenever people went to places like Berlin, for example, they would say, I'm going to Europe. And that meant real Europe. And this idea of also self-exotization, appropriating negative stereotypes about one's group and reverting their meaning to positive ones, such as presenting Balkan primitivism as something desirable and authentic. I was quite interested in this issue around authenticity, but in a way, it's self-exoticizing at the same time. And my broader, question or take on was, Serbia's position as not being in the EU, and so not, being classified as European, although being close to Europe. This, I thought, was quite complex. So in terms of connections with my research, I worked with Kurdish people in London. I am not sure if I would have called them Kurdish Londoners, although I call myself a Kurdish Londoner because I lived there for 16 years. And this multiplicity of identities and belonging I thought was quite relevant to my work also with with the Kurdish community in London. I'm also interested in, I don't know, how would, for example, the Serbians keep their languages, and how their language practices are shaped because of these, being in these transnational online and offline spaces. I think that's a lot from me. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Birgül. We do have some questions already coming in on the Q&A, which is fantastic. Do keep them coming, and we will come through to them at the Q&A at the end. So next up, let's go over to Mirca Madianou. Over to you.
Yes. Thank you so much for inviting us here, David, and many congratulations, Sanja. I'm really delighted to see the book published. Getting a book out is such an important milestone in one's career, and the first book, I think, even more so. So I'm very glad to be able to celebrate this moment here with you, and I hope the book is off to a great start, and that it travels wide and far. Full disclosure, I am intimately familiar with the book, or the research on which the book is based, as one of Sanja's PhD supervisors. I feel like I should disclose this. But it's a great pleasure to see the book out. And I also recognize, having read the book, that it has also evolved since the PhD. So it's not, it has metamorphosed, and it has evolved and matured, and I can see the writing is even more confident, and so that's really great, wonderful to see. And I also see that the book has taken on board developments over the last few years, so it is really based on the thesis, but a much sort of further developed version of the thesis. I want to kind of emphasize two strengths here of the book, and one is its interdisciplinarity. It really brings together and synthesizes different theories. Doesn't just add one theory on top of each other, but really works them into a kind of a new whole. And I think that is really significant. You bring together British cultural studies, media and communications, but also a lot of work on social media research and sort of the field of internet studies, theories of nationalism, and international relations. So it is really a major achievement in that sense. I also want to really emphasize the bottom-up aspect of the book, the fact that you really center people's experiences. You understand identity as performed through everyday life. And I think that is an important sort of contribution to the work on nationalism and the field of nationalism research. There is no fixed identity here, right? Positionalities is what you observe depending on context, and this fluidity is really important and very productive. And I appreciate how the book links ethnographic details to wider social transformations. So that is really, I think, an important contribution. And in this context, the term polymedia works quite well. And I feel maybe I should say something, as I was one of the people who put it forward as a term together with Danny Miller, but it's in the book's title. So maybe I should explain to those who have joined us what the term means, right? So the term polymedia was really an effort to shift the attention from social media's discrete platforms, let's say Facebook or WhatsApp, to really try to understand social media's environments which users navigate to suit their various needs, right? So we often talk about Facebook or Viber, you mentioned earlier, or Instagram, but these could be very ephemeral. They could be because, platforms may come and go. And we also see that people don't really just use one platform, but really a combination of platforms. And what's really important in your work is this navigation, really the fact that people navigate this kind of ecosystem. And so Polymedia was really an effort to try to put together this kind of more dynamic model of media as a composite structure of converging communicative opportunities within which social media can be understood. And according to this approach, the emphasis is on sort of this relational definition of these different media platforms from a user's point of view. So Polymedia highlights the ways in which users exploit the differences between media in order to manage their relationships, right? So choosing one platform over another carries meaning, right? To choose to call someone on WhatsApp carries meaning, as opposed to not use your webcam. It can signify a desire to have more intimacy through the cues of simultaneous communication, like video calling, like what we're experiencing right now, right? Whereas instant messaging would introduce more distance. So I really appreciate how you take this theory, which we developed with Danny Miller, my colleague Danny Miller, in our book Migration and New Media, in the context of migration. So you take this theory and you apply it to how people do nation, and that I think is really productive. It's really a very interesting application of the theory to see how national identity is performed, how you do national identity through this complex media environment that we all inhabit, how this navigation of the social media landscape produces identity, and how this identity is performed differently, whether you're performing it in relation to your friends in London, or people back home, or family members, or the diaspora more broadly. So I love how the book updates classic theories like Carl Deutsch's social communication theory in a digital media environment, right? My own first book, Mediating the Nation, was putting forward this audience-centered approach to identity. I was arguing that media, and in my case, that book was really focusing on broadcast media, was central to explaining how people shifted discourses from openness to closure, therefore erecting symbolic boundaries for exclusion or inclusion. And your work, Sanja, I think takes this discussion forward by applying the lens of polymedia, which helps explain the multiple and parallel discursive shifts in how people articulate their very nuanced identities. And I think from that point of view, you've really achieved something incredibly rich here, which advances our understanding of this performance of the nation in everyday life, in the diaspora, but I think actually also at home, because these are not these are sort of shifting boundaries. I had a question for you, because I've been thinking about your work recently. With the protests in Serbia that have been ongoing over the last few weeks, flags have been featuring very prominently. We've seen protests of over 300,000 people. I was thinking, what nation is being flagged here, right? What is the dominant discourse? So I just wanted to invite you, sort of end this very brief comment, to invite you to reflect a little bit on the latest developments, what's happening in Serbia. And for me, interestingly, that these protests were actually featuring flags. It wasn't necessary, right? You could have had protests without flags, but why was this kind of a clear articulation of national identity, a clear example of doing nation in these protests, which were also criticism of the government? So I just wanted to end by inviting you to comment on these latest developments. And is this an example of sort of doing nation from your point of view and from the analytical framework you put forward in your study? So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic, Mirca. Thank you very much. And last but absolutely by no means least, let's hand over to Sandra Obradović. Over to you.
Thanks, David. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you, Sanja, for giving me the chance to read this interesting book. Many times when I was reading it, I wondered if I ever participated in your research, because so many of the things that I read from your participants' accounts felt like auto-ethnography on my part. So as a kind of social psychologist interested in the topic of identity and history, what I found really interesting in the book is that it mirrors the approach that I think we should be taking in social psychology, which is thinking about identities relationally, which is it's very clearly from the book. I also think dialogically, so thinking about how processes of identifying are both informed by how we self-identify with a group and claim belonging to a group, but also the awareness of how we're being recognized by other people, and how a lot of times the way that we present and the way that we kind of portray our identities or perform them is in response to what we think is being seen by other people or assumed by other people about who we are. So I thought that was very beautifully captured, I think, in the destigmatizing strategies. There's an awareness of maybe what we think other people think about our national identities. And so we're responding in relation to that on kind of social media platforms and in everyday life. I also think there's an element of identity in the sense that identities are temporal. And I think that's also quite beautifully captured in the book, because it addresses the different migration waves and the different ways in which people have come to build these identities and do nationalism differently, because they have left the country at different points in time. They've had different migration experiences. And so their temporal relationship to the nation is also different to other people in the diaspora. I think what's interesting from the book, firstly, I think it's great to finally engage. Well, I say finally, this is for me finally. So a lot of social psychology is, I would say, slow to come to engage with the digital. We acknowledge it, we consider it as kind of something that future research should tackle, but we don't necessarily engage with it so much in our own practices. There is more and more of that now in a lot of collective action research, but I think it's a great example of how to study identities in the everyday in relation to other people and across multiple mediums and platforms that kind of scaffold different ways of doing and performing identity. So I thought that it's a great resource for anyone wondering, how do I do this in a digital age? Because I think those resources aren't always readily available. One of the challenges that this book poses, and that I often find myself facing with research that is on identity or identification, is the awareness and the recognition and the acknowledgement of the kind of malleability and flexibility and performativity of identities, you know, and how we can be different things in different spaces and claim different things in different spaces. But the paradox that identities in a lot of other contexts are very hard, and the realities of identities and conflict in intergroup relations that are politically divisive, they become very, very hard. And so a question to you, I guess, I think which is one I pose to everyone doing research in this area, is how do we reconcile that kind of the flexibility, malleability of identification, but at the same time, the hard reality of it in context of conflict and in context of how we see other people. When we stereotype, when we discriminate, it is on the basis of homogenous identities. But when we look in groups, supposedly in a diaspora, in a migrant community, and an ethnic community, there's so much diversity there that hardness isn't reflected in reality, but it's still something that we act very much on the basis of. So that's my kind of big question for you in terms of how do you take that forward in a digital space and in research that acknowledges the digital as part of doing nations. And yeah, just another thank you for the opportunity to engage with this really fascinating work.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to set the view back to gallery. I think there are a few things there specifically for you, Sanja. So, Sanja, should we we'll just take I'll give you a moment just to respond to those, and then we've got some questions already in the chat, in the Q&A that we'll go to. If anyone else got any other questions, do put them in chat or in Q&A, and we'll come to them. Sanja, do you want to respond?
Yes, thank you so much. I really enjoyed, seeing how you saw the book and what you took from it, have taken out from it. And also I'm very grateful and delighted to see, to hear what you found the strengths are and how it speaks to your work. Of course, I should have elaborated more on polymedia theory and concept, but I just thought maybe to focus on the book's contribution, and maybe I a little bit glossed over some concepts like Banal nationalism, Banal cosmopolitanism, but I'm of course very happy to answer any questions later in Q&A. In terms of first question on whiteness, yes, one of the arguments that I make, and it's not necessarily my original argument, I also build on other people's work where I talk about hierarchies within whiteness and how racism is not just, doesn't refer to stereotyping based on skin color, but to speaks more widely to cultural difference. Because what you can find in a lot of the literature on the Balkans is how the Balkans have been presented as the other to Europe. Other externally or also internally, because a lot of these people have internalized this kind of sense of inferiority. And then there are two dominant ways to explain this tension. One is that of Balkanism, that talks about the Balkan being in between, neither here nor there, so not part of the West, but not quite part of the East, and being marked by some kind of ambiguity. The other argument is that of gradients of Orientalism, that says that actually Orientalist discourse has been applied to the Balkans, looking at these different cultures based on how far or close they are to the East or the West. The position I've taken is more that of Balkanism, because if you look at, for instance, Greece, it's a more Eastern country in the Balkans, so you would think it's then more othered than perhaps Serbia. But at the same time, it's the EU country, it's the country, that has ancient civilization and so on. Whereas Serbia has went through the wars of the 90s and through that got some negative international reputation. This is where I drew on some literature on international relations as well, which kind of goes and answers Sandra's question. I think I can here link it to your question about this tension between flexibility of identity and being a hard reality. And you mentioned the context of conflict, but we don't even need to go to conflict. We can think of the everyday life. And this is where I say that identity is not purely a matter of choice, even if it's irrelevant for you. You're constantly negotiating in relation to how others see you. And this was very interesting for me as also a migrant. My national identity or cultural identity hadn't been that important for me until I came to this country, where you're constantly being seen in a certain way based on your foreign sounding accent or the way you look. I mean, yes, you're white, so maybe this is not the first point of difference, but then again, it's the way you sound and so on. So maybe perhaps your name and that sounds foreign. And so you're constantly in this dialogue with how you've been perceived. So yeah, it's not purely a matter of choice. And it's also, this is relevant in everyday life, not just in contexts of conflict. And yes, this is why it's very important to understand the particular context. This awareness is especially prominent in the immigration context, where especially towns like London that are so multicultural, multinational, where people with different passports live cheek by jowl, and this awareness of your identity becomes heightened. But also, yes, as you say, in conflicts, and we still live in the world of nations, like it or not. So this is kind of this inevitability of this kind of meanings being imposed on you. And to go back to Birgül's question, so there are multiple of meanings my respondents were responding to. So one would be that of Balkanism and of these otherness of, the Balkans within Europe. And if you want more evidence beyond my book, just think about Brexit and the campaign, the EU referendum campaign. It was targeted to specific Europeans, not all Europeans, which then comes as no surprise that social class is such an important tactic, because it was also linked to this sense of primitiveness, or, whether someone is a worthy migrant or not worthy migrant, which was very much predicated on what kind of capital they have. Economic capital, do they work in, are they educated, do they have high income or not? And maybe now to go to Mirca's question, that's really true. But I guess this speaks to this diversification of national identity, which happens when more people can express their voice of how they perceive their national identity. And actually, I start with a book of this divisiveness of Serbian identity throughout history. I start with recent history, which is the end of the Second World War, when you had monarchies who were supporting a monarchy, and you had communists, and later on during the 90s, when the war started, people who sided with Milosevic regimes, and who were often portrayed as for Serbia, though never self-identified as such, but it emerged through other Serbia. So people who wanted to show their opposition to the war, to the nationalist rhetoric, and generally Milosevic regimes were calling themselves other Serbia. So they wanted to kind of disassociate and to say, but they still say Serbia, right? They don't call themselves some kind of cosmopolitans. So they still associate themselves in national terms, but clearly showing that this is how we see our identity. And I guess this is then very similar to what we're observing today, where you have people who want, on the one hand, to say, this is what my national identity is about, but also perhaps as a response to the dominant rhetoric that maybe portrays them as less patriotic, because this is often what happens whenever someone doesn't adhere to the dominant narrative. This person is seen as non-patriotic and so on. So perhaps this is a response to that, to say, well, we are on the streets because we actually love our country, but we see our country to work in this way. However, here, just a small discretion, I want to say that, this is why I love this concept of banal nationalism, which I'm using in my book. It argues that, these banal practices are not naive. They do nation, they reproduce nation. And it was a really important kind of departure from this idea of patriotism and something very nice. And, because Michael Billig, who developed this concept, says that even these banal practices, just flagging, waving a flag, are not banning. They can do things, they lead to things. So yes, but I think it's been historically present in a sense, but now with social media, it's just getting more prominence, because they can also with emojis and so on. It's not just through pictures, but it's also through this social media communication that it can get, the voice can be amplified. That's what I want to say. I hope I've answered your question, but feel free to add any additional questions.
Does anyone want to come back in? If not, I'll take some questions. So, a question from Zadka Pavez. Thank you for a great presentation, Sanja. I wanted to ask about the impact of AI on national identity performance or doing the nation. Any thoughts?
Sorry, no, this research took place between July 2015 and November 2018, where I guess AI was still not having that much power or prominence as it does today.
And it's AI is one of those things that suddenly just seems to have appeared, and how we're dealing with it. Another question, and I'll ask I'll ask the questions generally to everyone. And this is a slightly broader one, but about from Mo Ali. Any advice or suggestions for where to read more on the role of digital media and nationalism?
Well, if you look at the references in my book, maybe start from there and then, but I'm happy if you get in touch via email to suggest you some more readings. But if I may just take a quick back to Mirca's question, just to say when I said amplify, I think this is very important just to understand that these are not inventions in the age of social media, but we can say that social media have amplified some of this phenomena that we are observing. Because when I was, looking back at the kind of historically division of Serbian national identity and so on, I want to say, this has been long before social media or proliferation, but we can say that these media amplified what we are observing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, social media is now sort of the water that we're all bathing in all the time. If you take social media more broadly, we all have, or most people have WhatsApp or Weibo or Viber or Signal now. We're all, certainly in my case, on Facebook too much of the time. And you're saying about about banal nationalism. I think that social media, has made banal nationalism. It is more around us even more than it has been previously. It's almost impossible to get away from. I mean, almost everywhere you go. I mean, certainly I do. I have my mobile phone with me, and it's like you're waiting for the bus. So I look at Facebook, and it's what's going on, and that reproduction of that banal nationalism is everywhere, and it's all pervasive in a way that I don't think it was possible for it to be before social media became so ubiquitous.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. So I can give you one example and also illustration of what I mean when I say that practices of doing nation are embedded in all range of life. So there was a participant who was fascinated with Novak Djokovic, and there were plenty of participants who were fascinated, but I'm just saying one. And you can clearly say that this is not just because they like tennis or they're fascinated with his sporting achievements, but also very clearly it's linked to his national identity and, his openness about it. And one way, was this person had a tennis, emoji of a tennis ball in her WhatsApp status. So this is very interesting. It's also how some ordinariness is not as ordinary when you dig further into this. And I guess this can be an interesting conversation for people interested in ethnography in combination with other methods. Just looking at this tennis ball, it's just, this person likes tennis. But, when you start talking with this person, you understand this person absolutely fascinated with Djokovic. You understand she's very proud because he's also Serb. And this is where you start realizing this tennis ball is also a symbol of national identity. It's not just this flag, there are emojis of flag which make it even more make it easier. And I think this maybe also links back to Birgül's question, and that is there are a lot of emphasis on Europeanness and being European. Many participants, especially those that arrived in the second half of the 90s and in the late 90s or early 2000s, especially those in third wave, would always say, I'm a European. And, whereas they cannot always put EU flag because EU is European Union flag, they would somehow find a way to portray themselves also as European along with their national identity, which then is kind of used to give this national identity another layer of meaning as being, European. I think I just wanted to give you one example how it's interesting that even something that is not at first sight maybe an expression of national identity becomes. And you're right, in a sense, social media have even enabled people to express their identities in various ways.
Birgül, did you want to come back on that?
Sorry.
No.
Sorry, am I?
Yeah, no, you're good. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, could you just repeat the last bit, what you said? I didn't hear properly.
Me, you mean?
Yes.
I was just referring back to your point about, whiteness, the Balkans, and I just said how you're right. Europeanness would be one of common strategies or common way, expressions of identity, where it is used to position oneself, as being European as well. So it was very common, and I interpreted it as often a strategy of providing a wider context of interpreting this national identity.
Yes, I thought your book quite nicely deals with essentialisms around, being European, but how this is also kind of contested. For example, when I look at how Europeanness is understood in Greece, it's never like being real European. It's never, for example, being like German or Swedish. And I thought you did, quite you quite nicely highlight that, because there are all these essentialisms around what is real Europe and what's not. So whenever, for example, somebody visits Athens, I'm not in Athens right now, but it's like, oh, this is real Balkans. It's not real Europe, because from architecture to cement on the street, it never represents that real Europe that's much more, kind of imagined as cleaner, and the architecture is different and people's behavior. So whenever, for example, there's a heated conversation around politics, or there are tensions in conversations, immediately this would be associated with being Balkan. And you do deal with these stereotypes and essentialisms, and what is, real Europe and what's not, and how this is all connected, being part of the European Union or not. That's what resonated with me, and I thought your book quite nicely deals with all these complexities.
And it's fascinating that being like real Europe and the European Union, that's a complicated relationship, because I'm at the risk of being too personal about things, I still feel European. 52% of my fellow country folk, I think, had a different view on things, but it's that idea of real Europe, what counts as Europe and the European Union. Sorry, Mirca, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to the example of Greece, because having done research, not recently on Greece, I think it's kind of, I would say, sort of a more sort of ambivalent picture, because you have on the one hand, I think you have multiple identities being performed, and I think the ambivalence is really key here, and there might be competing definitions of the nation. Some might be much more sort of aspiring to a European idea of identity and cosmopolitanism, and in parallel, you might have a different nation that is being performed. And sometimes these contradictions exist in everyday life all the time. And I think actually that's kind of something that you see in Sanja's book as well, that it isn't just one discourse that prevails necessarily. It is this constant negotiation of different identities and discourses about identity. And I think that's the value of taking this kind of perspective, which is much more ethnographic, from the bottom up, rather than imposing a particular lens, but to really see how people shift, from one position to another. So, yeah, and in a way, I was kind of trying to get to that a little bit with my question towards the end, which nation is being performed in the protests in Serbia, because this is obviously a constant performance. And it's very interesting that protests would call upon the national flag, right? Rather than, another symbol. You could say if this is sort of a bottom-up sort of grassroots attempt to sort of protest, why would they call upon a national symbol which might be perceived as sort of oppressive in some instances? But yeah, just to point out that I think it is a much more complex picture, and throughout the Balkans, you don't really have one version of the nation that is clearly foregrounded, but competing ones, and often fighting, with each other, or contradicting each other, seemingly. And other times, perhaps this somehow contradiction appears to, just simply coexist in tension with each other, but not necessarily one prevailing over the other, one discourse prevailing over the other. Yeah, over to you, Sanja.
Yeah, I also wanted to say that in these protests, one thing that was a bit striking were banners that said Beograd je opet svet, which means Belgrade is again the world, which were some of banners prominent in the 90s in the protest in Belgrade that were opposed to the war. So again, finding this association of, we want our country to be different. But then these flags thinking, can also be understood through the prism of civic nationalism, rather than just ethnic, in a sense that protesters are oriented to changing institutions. So it's all about, a quest for institutions to do their job, or to work and to have independency of judiciary and different, proper division of powers as well. So in that sense, if you think of nationalism, or nationalism or the nation important for the function of democracy as well, I think in a sense that you elect governments in elections, and that so I guess this can help us understand why the flags are there, but yeah, it also links to what I previously said and what you were saying about the competing definitions and perceptions of what nation is about and what the people want the nation to look like.
We've just got a couple more questions on the Q&A, so I think we'll take those two questions and then wrap up, if that's okay. So, question from Phyllis Aiden. Nation implies some type of coherence, community, or commonalities. If identity is situational, temporal, fluid, why do we have to conceptualize diaspora Serbians as a nation or having national identities? Why do we start with a category of Serbian national identity instead of people coming from territory called Serbia? I'm asking this because it sounds like your data could be interpreted as a construction of a diaspora nation, though this is more diverse than the nation you'll find in Serbia. So what are the limitations of imagined communities theory for you?
Okay, imagine community, and the first part of the question I was.
If you hit on the Q&A button, you'll be able to see it all. But it's, nation implies some type of coherence, community, or commonalities. If identity is situational, temporal, fluid, why do we have to conceptualize diaspora Serbians as a nation or having national identities? Why do we start with a category of Serbian national identity instead of people coming from a territory called Serbia? I'm asking this because it sounds like your data could also be interpreted as a construction of a diaspora nation, though this is more diverse than the nation you'll find in Serbia. So what are the limitations of imagined community theory for you?
Yeah, but these are two questions, so let me answer them. First, these people don't come necessarily from Serbia, and yes, indeed, I should have said at the very beginning, I selected them based on their self-identification as Serbs. But the thing is that, as I previously said in response to discussants' questions, is that the identity is not purely a matter of choice, but it is negotiated in relation to how others perceive us. So it is constructed through this kind of a dynamic. What they have all in common is, as I said, they were selected on their self-identification, but also the perception of a Serbian identity as being stigmatized. So they all had some relation to this identity, and this identity was important to them, as you could see also in some of examples I included in my slides. You can see sometimes these were pictures of food. In other, as I said, with this tennis ball in a WhatsApp status, which doesn't even look at first sight as an expression of national identity. So these all people relate to this identity in a way that it is important to them, and they all kind of perceive it to an extent as stigmatized. That's their perception. I'm not saying it is necessarily, but the way they engage their practices to correct this stigma or to fight this stigma or whatever you want to counter this stigma differ. So therefore, I say there are multiple Banal nationalism. I'm also talking about oscillation between different identities, because national identity is not always central to these people's lives. And, so yes, I do say that cosmopolitan identities are sometimes used as strategy, but this is not necessarily always true. As I again say, national identities are not always central to their lives, but they exist in parallel also with other identities, and sometimes are embedded in other identities, as I said, in like family practices, for example. But yeah, what unites them is their relation to this identity and perception of it being stigmatized, and then their practices, how they communicate, which social media they use, what kind of discourses they share would differ between them.
And I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that question. Otherwise, I'll go to the last one we've got from Luka Bozovic. Thank you. Hi, thank you for the presentation. I enjoyed it. I was wondering how often participants of the research mentioned the church and the role of the church in doing nation.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And this is where I said how also ethnicity is not just central to working class migrants, but can be also central to middle class migrants. Because I didn't find this clear distinction between people, for instance, older migrants compared to newer migrants in terms of how church is central for them. But I should maybe give an anecdote. When I started recruiting participants and asking people to join my research, they were always referring me to the church. Go and study the community around the church. And I was like, why is it perceived that if I want to study Serbian migrants in London, it's for me to go and study community around the church? So there is a perception, even within these people or other people from the former Yugoslavia, who heard about my research and they know how the church is central to community life. For me, it was very interesting, this construction of what Serbian is about and what Serbian in London means. But I shall say that I had particularly kind of challenges with recruiting people who, if we go maybe to my slides where I showed you these different waves of migration, and then I showed you second wave. And within second wave, you have like some people that are self-proclaimed atypical Serbs. So these are people usually who arrived in the late 90s or early 2000 as a consequence of the aftermath of the Civil War and what it meant for economy, culture, and everything else. And these people were the ones who were trying actually to disassociate themselves from being Serbian, just because the idea of Serbian in London was someone who is associated with the church and with that kind of discourse. And for me, that was really interesting because, for instance, one of these people had a big calendar in their living room with all the dates of the times they were going to Belgrade. And this person was like, no, I'm not a typical Serb. You shouldn't be talking to me. And when he actually agreed to be my participant and I visited him at his house, I saw a big calendar in the living room with all the dates that he's planning to go to Belgrade. So the issue is very complicated, but it's very interesting on the one hand how it's been constructed. And secondly, how it is not just about working class migrants as migration literature would talk about. For instance, one study about Croatians in Australia would talk about that career distinction based on class, which wasn't the case in my study.
Sandra, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I had a kind of just a question for Sanja thinking about going forward, because what I thought was interesting when you were presenting one of the screenshots from the Viber conversation was that there's a kind of secondary effect of diaspora on the people who don't leave, which is the articulation and the use of a language that isn't theirs, right? Viber stickers are in English. These social media platforms are new. And so I thought I was interested in kind of your reflections of thinking about the kind of secondary or spillover effects on diaspora communities, home communities or families in relation to engaging in, cosmopolitan identities and how that kind of sometimes spills over. So I don't know if that's something that you reflected on with your data or something you've thought more about. I'd love to hear it.
That's really fascinating what you said, because I didn't quite discuss the spillover effect on people who stay, but I do talk in my chapter 7 about the role of Viber, because it's more actually people. So if we think about Viber as opposed to WhatsApp, Viber is still, I guess, more popular in Serbia and former Yugoslavia, especially among older generations. And I guess, some of them start using WhatsApp more. So that could be one spillover effect, because, their families abroad are more likely to use WhatsApp over Viber. But at the same time, for me, Viber was this kind of a very interesting marker of people's connections with what kind of connections they had with Serbia or other countries in the region. For me, it was, I remember I was actually in the church and someone's phone rang and it was Viber's, a sound. And I immediately knew that this person has strong connections with Serbia, because, it is based on these privately oriented platforms were mainly used for strong relationships, what we call strong social ties. And, this was a good then indicator. Whereas if someone is mainly relying on WhatsApp, that is very likely to mean that their family and important others are not actually in Serbia. And I gave you an example, Angela's example of her WhatsApp group with her family. As a matter of fact, as I said, her family left when she was 5, so they are not living. They don't live in Serbia. So it partially answers your question, but it's a fantastic, I think, observation. I think it's something would be really interesting to explore further. So thank you, Sandra.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, then.
I think we're coming to the end of our time. So does anyone on the panel have any last thoughts? Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you everybody to coming. I'm sorry if you can hear that noise over there. That's my cats trying to get in. They want to come and say hello. I suppose congratulations particularly to Sanja on the book. I think we also have to give congratulations to Mirca on getting your student through the PhD and onto the book. Our next event is Sanja, go for it.
Yeah, I also wanted to say thank you to David Morley. He is also attending this event. He was my second supervisor and really extremely important source of help, guidance, support. So I'm very grateful to him. And also his intellectual work inspired my own. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Well, and thank you. Congratulations to David as well. Sorry. Our next event is going to be at the end of May on Pavan Manno's new book, Straight Nation, Heteronormativity and Other Exigencies of Post-Colonial Nationalism. But before then, we have our conference and we will hopefully be live streaming the plenaries from there. So I hope you've all enjoyed today's session. Thank you all very much for coming, and we will see you at the next event. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.